Behold, for I have returned. Alien Biospheres Part 12 has been defeated, and honestly, I very, very rarely say this, but honestly, I'm kind of pleased with how that one turned out. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely not perfect. There's a bunch of things I wish I could have done better, but on the whole, I think it actually came out kind of okay. And now that that's done, I can enjoy a period of relative ease and rest and relaxation. And speaking of which, I don't know exactly how long this one is going to take me to edit, but I imagine this will be the last episode, and in fact the last video, before the end of December. So that being the case, happy holidays, happy winter festivities, happy December to anyone and everyone watching and or listening. And before we resume conlanging, not only would I like to say thank you once again to all of the patrons for your continued support, but also a special shout out today to, where's he gone? There he is, Agma Schwa, who, if you don't know him, I'll link to his channel somewhere. This person has recently done something that is the envy of most conlangers. I know I'm a little bit late to the party on this front, and if I'd managed to record one of these episodes in the last few months, I probably would have made an announcement then. But Agma Schwa has gone ahead and published a reference grammar of his conlang Arujun, which you yourself can purchase at a link that I will also provide somewhere, wherever I can. I've been working my way through it since I finished working on Alien Biospheres. I'm very much enjoying it so far. I find the backstory of the whole thing quite enchanting. And as I understand it, Agma Schwa has plans to expand upon the whole premise with more Arujun-related stuff over on his channel. So go and subscribe to him and check out the book and support fellow conlangers. But in the meantime, returning to the task at hand, I've got a few points of follow-up from when we last left off. First of all, last time I was trying to figure out the forms for this word that meant tree, and really stupidly, I forgot to include the class marker in that, so the forms that I got out the end were completely wrong. So I've gone ahead and redone them here. And as I've been doing these nouns, I've become increasingly perturbed by the preponderance of stress on the final syllable of all these words. Because that does happen an awful lot, and I'm okay with it in principle, but I keep seeing places where I would prefer it to be shifted over a bit. I don't know, it's just not quite jiving with me. So I'm toying with, I haven't 100% committed to this idea yet, but I'm almost certain I'm going to go for it. Because I did bring this up a few episodes ago, of the idea of introducing another stress shift to try and rebalance things, but I thought that might mess with our auxiliaries that we'd so meticulously worked out, so I didn't want to do anything too hastily. But I think what I can do, if I say here that at some point relatively recently in history, I still haven't decided exactly when it's going to happen, but if a penult is long or closed, then it gets the stress. That should still give us a decent amount of variety in where stress is placed, because we'll still get stress occasionally on the antepenult and the final syllable, and in fact even on a short or open penult in the case of the epenthesis. But I think that should help just alleviate this overabundance of word final stress that I'm seeing. So like for example in these forms here for the word that means rock, in the singular, since we've got that closed syllable there, it would be irnus instead of irnus, but the plural would still be irun. And then for this form that means tree, the singular nominative, plural accusative, and singular locative are all the same, which I like. I like that syncretism. I think that's cool. But then all of those, since it's a closed penult, that would be ostos instead of ostos. So unless I somehow encounter some huge problem that would cause as we go along, I'm pretty certain I'm going to stick with that idea. In the next item of follow-up, we were talking last time about prohibitives, and I got something wrong, but in a really interesting way. So I had said that in Mandarin, one of the common ways of forming a prohibitive is to use the word bie, which is true, and that the word bie means to cut, which is also true. However, I always just assumed that that was because bie, meaning to cut, was used in the sense of, like in English, to cut something out, to stop it from happening. I always assumed that that's how it naturally arrived at the state of being a prohibitive. But a couple of commenters pointed out that that is actually not true. And instead, the bie that you use for negating imperatives is actually a contraction of buyao, which means to not want to. And then just saying buyao over time that just blended together into bie. And apparently it was a later innovation that they decided this bie that we're using to negate imperatives just happens to sound exactly like the word for to cut, so let's use the same character. Which is really, really interesting. And in fact, to me, it is strikingly similar to what happens in Latin. Because in Latin, one of the ways that you can negate an imperative is to use the auxiliary noli. So if you wanted to say, like, don't go, it would be noli ire. And noli is very transparently just a contraction of non voli. But non obviously means not, and voli means want. So it's exactly the same thing of a phrase that means do not want to, getting contracted into a prohibitive auxiliary. Which makes me wonder how common that is cross-linguistically. Because if Mandarin and Latin are doing basically exactly the same thing, I wonder if this is just like a thing that happens. But I think that's really, really interesting. Now, admittedly, that whole bie meaning to cut being used as a prohibitive was kind of the foundation of this idea of using this verb that means to remove, forming the prohibitive. But despite that, I still think this works, because as I think we talked about, having asymmetry in different types of negation, different auxiliaries being used for different types of negation, is very, very common. And I can absolutely see remove or take away being used as a negative in some contexts. So I'm going to stick with that, and that leads us quite nicely into what we're going to talk about today, I think, which is negation. Because I think I said last time I wanted to get into negation properly. Now, many long ages ago, back when this Conlang was young, I thought long and hard about whether I want negation to go on the auxiliary or on the lexical verb. And I would prefer if it went on the auxiliary, just because that would give us some more variety in these auxiliaries, because as I say, we're going to be using these so much, any excuse to add a little bit of variety and not see the same words over and over and over and over again. But at the same time, it does make a little bit more sense to me that the preferred spot would be on the lexical verb, not only because you're negating the semantic content of the lexical verb as opposed to just the grammatical stuff of the auxiliary, but also because there will definitely be instances in which, because our lexical verbs are converbs, remember, so if we have a converb clause, there will absolutely be instances where we want to negate the converb clause but not the main clause. So if I wanted to say something like, having not eaten dinner, I was very hungry. So in that case, the having not eaten part, that is a negated converb clause, whereas the I was very hungry, that obviously in the affirmative, and that's the main clause. So in that case, the negative would have to go on the converb, so there must be some way of doing that in this language. But I would still like it if it was at least acceptable to put the negative on the auxiliary verb as well. And I think one sneaky way that I think I'm going to do that, I'm going to bank on the fact that these auxiliary verbs are going to be used all the time, they're really semantically weak, and they come from copulae, which are notoriously messy, and I think I'm going to invoke one last instance of suppletion, because both of the copulae already have some suppletion going on. But I think for one of them, I don't think two, I think having both of them supplete in the negative would be a little bit of a stretch. It's not unprecedented, because Turkish kinda does that, where you've got olmak, which is the sort of standard verb for to be, sort of, and that is negated with deil. but then the locative / existential copula var, the negative of that is juk, and both of those are irregular compared to, for most other verbs, you just use a m suffix. But even so, I think doing that for both of these would be a little bit of a stretch. So I think for just one of them, it's going to have a separate verb, a separate negative form that derives from a completely different verb that just sort of got assimilated into the same paradigm. Whereas for the other, I think we should stick with just a simple negative affix or something. Now, for the one that is suppletive, I would prefer if that was the more commonly used one. And looking at our chart here, actually, why do I have both of these? Don't know why I left both of them there. But regardless, I'm pretty sure that forms 1 and 2 will be the most used. And forms 1 and 2 both come from the old, just regular, standard, non-locative copula. So if that's the case, we're going to need a lexical source for something that means to not be. Now, we could, theoretically, just say that there is a verb that literally just means to not be. But that feels kind of like cheating. I think maybe for the other negation strategy, for negating the lexical verbs, and maybe for the other auxiliary as well, we could just say that there is a single negative particle that was inherited from the Protolang that was always just had an intrinsically negative meaning, and it just got smacked on and fused on with the rest of the thing and became a negative affix. But in this case, for a negative copula, the thing that immediately springs to mind is to lack. That is a pretty common source for negative stuff. The only thing is lack, I think, at least to my mind, has slightly more of an existential quality to it. So like if you were using a locative copula to say, there is a dog, I think if you wanted to say, there is not a dog, you could say, there lacks a dog. Like that makes a lot more sense to me than using it for the regular copula. So I don't know. I think it's probably justifiable. But another option I was thinking about as well, and this was actually inspired by a chat I was having with Lycan, another Conlanging channel. Go and check his channel out too. I'll link to that one too. Everyone's getting a plug today. But he mentioned that apparently in Japanese, the verb that means to differ can be used as a kind of negative in certain contexts. Like to answer no to a yes or no question, you can say it differs, which is pretty cool. So maybe a phrase like it is different to or different from could turn into this negative form. So if you want to say the cat is not a dog, you could say the cat differs from a dog. And then that begs the question, is it that this verb, this to be different verb, is that transitive in the Protolang? Like the cat differs the dog? Or are we going to have to make it transitive by using one of our applicatives? I'm a little bit hesitant to use grammatical affixes on something that should be, I think, fairly simple, especially if it's going to be suppletive. You generally don't see suppletion in, like, words that have a lot of grammatical marking on them. Usually they're very simple roots that get suppleted early on. But I don't know, maybe it's possible. Like in Ainu, the standard word for to give, which is usually a pretty basic root in most languages, in Ainu it is the verb to have with a causative on it. So to cause to have, which makes perfect sense. I'm just surprised that such a simple meaning would be derived using grammatical inflection and just not have its own root. So I don't know, maybe we can get away with something like that with an applicative? I'm going to go away and have a think about that, and let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm also not going to faff around with phonological forms at this point, just because I did spend like 19 episodes fiddling around trying to get these forms exactly right, and I don't want to subject you guys to more of that if I don't have to. So I'm probably going to do a little bit of work on that offline. But what I will do is make some space on the chart. Is it called the affirmative or the positive? Is affirmative just for responding to yes or no questions? Or does it just mean not negative? Well, I'm going to leave it like that for now. Feel free to correct me in the comments. So forms 1 and 2 in the negative will take the suppletive verb, but forms 3 and 4 will derive from exactly the same place as their positive counterparts, except with a little negative affix as well. Actually, If we use to differ or to be different from as the source of the negative suppletion in the forms 1 and 2, then that does mean we could use lack as the general negative for elsewhere. And that would make sense if it's indeed the locative copula that we're negating. Well, regardless, whatever its lexical source is, we have to think about what type of construction was the original negative. Assumedly, the negative would just be an adverb, which immediately makes me think of a converb. So it could be lack in a converb form. So if you wanted to say, like, there is not a dog, you would say, there is a dog lackingly. Now, if it's a converb, that means it's going to have to take the same suffixes that lead to case marking. So it's going to have to take one of these endings. I don't know why today Excel decides it wants to show where these page breaks are, but I can't seem to get rid of it, so sorry about that. And I think the only one of these that really makes consistent sense would be the imperfective. So either lack or some similar verb with a negative meaning in the imperfective converb with this hin suffix, or we just say that the negative adverb is older than that, and its ultimate source has been lost to history. It was just effectively always negative. That would give us a little bit more freedom, but it also feels a little bit like cheating. It shouldn't really, but it does to me. Because if we say it's a converb, that means that the standard negative strategy only evolved after case marking was already a thing. So there would have been something else before that. That means it's a very recent, well, not very recent, but comparatively recent negative strategy. And I don't know, negatives tend to stick around for a while. So I'm actually tempted to just say it was just an inherently negative thing. Well, we'll come back to that. First, let's just have a think about potential phonological form. We want it to be short, monosyllabic, which shouldn't be too hard considering we can just say that with frequent use it gets reduced anyway. And it should be distinct from some of these other affixes we have. I haven't used very many y's yet. Or does, actually. Or buzz. I don't want to do cl, because that's too similar to the polite imperative. It would be nice, definitely not essential, but it would be nice if we can get some distinct forms from the affirmative form 3 and 4. If we can get some infixation or phonological alternations, or make it so that in some way they're not just these forms with one extra syllable stuck on. And speaking of which side is it going to go on? Is it going to be a prefix or a suffix? Well, this language is prototypically head final, so the auxiliary verbs initially would have always been at the end of the sentence, and the converbs would have come beforehand, so I guess it would be a prefix. Doesn't have to be, we can easily justify it as the negative element just got stranded afterwards anyway, especially if it was ancestrally an adverb. Adverbs are typically pretty free to jump around various places in the sentence, but I guess if we're following the traditional order of modifier and head, then in its head final state, adverbs would be favored before verbs, or whatever else they're modifying. So the original locative copula was the akya form. Oh, and that raises another issue. Would these forms still supplete if it's got a negative affix? I think they would. If that suppletion was already done and happened before the negative affixed on, yeah, I'm pretty sure that would remain like that. So the hun forms that are becoming the regular copula, that's the one we need suppletion for. Whereas this one is just going to be an affix. And I think this same affix is going to apply not only to forms 3 and 4 of the auxiliary, but also to all other verbs as well. It's going to be the standard negation strategy. Because I think it would be not impossible, but again, a little bit of a stretch, if there were separate negatives for one half of the auxiliary verb, the other half of the auxiliary verb, and all other verbs. If all three of those had their own separate negatives, that would be a little bit much, I think. And that also means that, although, as I say, I would like there to be at least a little bit of phonological mix-up that happens with these forms when comparing the positive and the negative. We have to watch out that it doesn't become too messy for the converb forms, because then otherwise for every single verb we're going to have to make a whole other set of principal parts just for the negative. Oh yeah, and I guess the negative would come between the person marking and the verb root. I can only imagine that the negative became associated with the verb first. That just makes more sense to me. Which is another argument in disfavor of the lack converb idea, if it was older than that and got associated with the verb first. Okay, let's just see what happens when we add this bar prefix before the root. And don't worry, I'm not going to faff around with this for ages. I'm just going to do a few tests and just see if I like any of them, and then make some decisions off air. Okay, that's not terrible, because of course this B turns into a V between vowels, and I think for the reduplicated stem, more often than not, all that's going to do is make the final syllable long. And that's kind of just a product of the fact that vowels are never really lost between voiced stops and other sounds, other than sonorants, so they kind of just stick out more. So let's just see what happens if we use a voiceless stop instead. So the thing I realize almost immediately is that vowel will be lost between the T and the K, which ultimately will result in a word final cluster, which then through epenthesis and all that would give us, in a lot of cases, an extra syllable, unless we say the stress is on the ta, because it's the negative. So if you're stressing the negative, I did not do that. Okay, neither of those are bad. I think both of them could work. I just want to do one more test before we move on. What if it was a Y in the Protolang? Actually, that is a pretty good question, because that Y could potentially palatalize the sound that comes before it, if we say that that vowel was just elided very early on just because of rapid speech. Oh dear. Tmiai. That is not good. Let's just pretend that that first Y got lost for that one. Nah, I can see where this is going, because the palatal stop is going to turn into a Y word finally in most cases anyway, so it's just going to give us a lot of final y's, which I don't like at all. Okay, if that's not going to work, one more idea, and I promise this is the last one. Let's change that Y to a W and see how that affects things. Okay, that's a little bit better. I do like some of these clusters, like the kv and the sv. Okay, well that's given me plenty to think about, so I will probably do some more fiddling around with this and get back to you next time. But before we finish up, I did want to talk about at least one more thing. This is kind of a diversion from what we've been talking about, but it's on my mind now. So recently, well actually not all that recently now, it was probably like 4 or 5 months ago, but still, at some point within living memory, I was having a chat with Artifexian, as we sometimes do, and it looks like the plugs continue. Now Artifexian is getting a shout out. But we were having a chat about Conlang stuff, and the topic of comparatives came up. And I originally wasn't planning on thinking about comparatives until further down the line, once we had some more stuff for adjectives nailed down. But in the discussion that we had, a couple of interesting ideas came up that I just want to sketch out now, and we'll probably end up revisiting them way down the line. But just so that I don't forget, we'll just have a quick look at them now. So comparative. The comparative is something like, the cat is bigger than the dog. So you're giving two nouns and you're saying that one of them expresses the adjective more intensely or more fully or to a greater degree than the other. And there are lots of different ways of doing this cross-linguistically. In some languages, you just list them out as two separate clauses. You say, the cat is big, the dog is small, which I think is pretty fun. And in fact, if you start with that as a basis and sort of keep going with that idea, you might end up with what happens in classical Nahuatl, where one of the ways you can form a comparative construction is to say the equivalent of, the cat is big, not the dog, which on the surface looks almost exactly like a than construction in English, like the cat is bigger than the dog, except you use a negative particle instead of an adposition, which I think is pretty fun. And by the way, yes, probably the cross-linguistically most common way of doing this is just to use an adposition that means something like than. And in fact, I think the three most common ones to use are from, to, and at, if I remember correctly. So the cat is big at the dog, or the cat is big from the dog. But another extremely common one is to just use a verb that means something along the lines of exceed. So you say the cat is big exceeding the dog. So that's pretty straightforward, but the thing that came up in the talk I had with Artifexian was that, and of course I can't remember what the language is right now, but there is at least one language that uses the verb defeat. The cat is big defeating the dog, which I think is really cool. So I think I'm going to do that for this language. So use a verb that either means to defeat or overcome or something like that, and then that will be in a converb form, specifically the first principal part, the imperfective converb, and then have the object of comparison in the accusative being the direct object of the defeating. So the cat is big while defeating the dog. And then for superlatives, superlatives are very often just formed from the comparative plus the word all. So like the cat is bigger than all means the cat is the biggest. So we can do basically the same thing here. If we have a word that means all, or a great number or something, and then if we incorporate that into the verb to defeat, because we've established we do have noun incorporation in this language. I haven't decided exactly how extensive the noun incorporation is yet, but we'd definitely be able to get away with something like this. So we say, the cat is big, all defeatingly. I think that's pretty fun. And then for equatives, like the cat is as big as the dog, like the cat and the dog are the same size. I'm going to use another pretty common strategy cross-linguistically and use a verb that means to reach. So the cat is big, reaching the dog, which I think is pretty intuitive. And then the contrastive, which is like the cat is not as big as the dog. Now you can see in English, the contrastive is formed just by negating the equative. It's the exact same construction, except you just put not in there to mean they're not the same size. Or you can say the cat is less big than the dog. But it's pretty cross-linguistically common to form the contrastive just by negating either the comparative or the equative. And in this case, I think we're going to do the latter. We're just going to do the same as the equative, except with a negative attached to reach. The cat is big, not reaching the dog. And then for the sublative, the cat is the least big. We can pull the same trick that we pulled for the superlative, except we passivize it. So being defeated by all, or being all defeated. And then finally, the last one, just for a bit of fun, the excessive. The cat is too big. Now, I have seen a grand total of one language ever with a distinct morphological form for the excessive, and that is Basque. In Basque, you can take an adjective and you put a little suffix on, I think it's en, and that means too much, whatever it is. And this is the one that I really like, because in the chat I was having with Artifexian, one of the ideas that came up was to fear, and I really like that idea, because if something is too much, then that has an intrinsically negative connotation, you know? If it's too big, then it's so big that it's gone past the point of being good, you know? So we need some sort of adverb or marker that encodes an inherently sort of negative sense to it. Negative as in bad. So I think to fear, if we use that in a converb construction, it's fearfully big. I really like that because it very neatly gets across this sense of it's so big that it's causing fear. So to me it seems very natural that that could become used as an adverb to form the excessive with. I can also imagine that being used just as a general intensive adverb as well. Just to say something's extremely big, you would say it's fearfully big. Which seems to be pretty common in a lot of languages that I've seen, that there's free variation between just intensive and excessive. Kind of like in Mandarin, how you can use tai to mean either very much or too much. And I think you might be able to do the same thing with en in Turkish, because en is both the superlative and the intensive, I think. My memory's a bit fuzzy, but I know it's got some sort of ambiguity to it. So yeah, if we have some sort of intensive adverb that comes from to fear in converb form, and if it's the main way that you mark an excessive. I think that's a really cool idea. And before we finish up, I think I'm just going to derive one more noun, just because we really do need to pick up the pace when it comes to vocabulary generation. I was really hoping that we'd be able to do Lexemba this year, but Alien Biospheres just took too long, and we're just not yet at the point where we can start coining vocabulary left and right. Oh well, maybe next year. Oh yeah, and by the way, last time I gave the example the ox is a female, and I think I very stupidly said, yeah, that makes sense, because I was just thinking of ox as just general bovine, but obviously oxen are defined as being neutered males, so yeah, that was just me being dumb and absent-minded. But fortunately that has no effect on the language whatsoever, so we're all good. Anyway, I'm going to do another noun, and I'm feeling an animate noun this time around. Just looking at these potential phonological forms I have, got a bunch of potential verb stems to use, but it should be fairly quick and easy to assign meaning to those later. What I really want to do is to start trying to suss out these different declension patterns. So I want some noticeable phonological differences in the stems that we're attaching the case endings to see what sort of differences that generates. And in this case, the root that we used ended in a vowel, and that was preceded by a cluster, effectively. So that blocked that final vowel from being lost. So that one was very vowel heavy in terms of its stem ending. So now I think it would be prudent to go with something that ends in a consonant and see what differences that results in. I'm going to use mihun, and for that in the Protolang, if that U is fronted, then that H couldn't have been a pharyngeal or any of the back consonants. And because I is neutral, I guess we could say it spreads fronting to the following vowel, but that's not a guarantee. So I guess we could just say it comes from vowel hiatus, just an E and an U crunched together, and that H would need to be a ch initially so that it doesn't get just completely lost. And I think I'm going to have it mean bird. Mihun. That sounds like a nice word for bird. Okay, so those would be the protoforms. And to speed things up a bit, and just to help me out, let's fire up Lexigy. Okay, let's see how this works. Starting off with the singular forms. Oh, that's interesting. So the N followed by the voiced uvula turns into a geminate N, which blocks the final vowel from being lost, and it's also lowered because of the uvula. Okay, that's pretty cool. And now for the dual form, which is just built straight off the singular. Why are we getting an A ending? I don't really understand why that's happening. It should just stay as E, shouldn't it? Oh, but now we've got this trace evolution feature. Okay, for some reason it's inserting an epenthetic vowel between the L and the E. Well, I'm pretty sure that's just a mistake in the programming somewhere. And why is that L sticking around between vowels? Oh, because it thinks it's in a cluster. Yeah, that L really shouldn't be there. Okay, finessed those a little bit. And finally, the plurals. Okay, now this is an interesting thing because with the plurals, because the original stem ended in a nasal, that nasal is in direct contact with the T. And whereas in the neuter form, because that T was always intervocalic, it was very easy to justify that the T would just get skipped over. Whereas with this, we could still say that just the ending gets ground down and the T disappears, but we could also say that in this form the T lingers, and that'll be a difference in declension. Some forms, essentially forms that originally ended in a nasal, a T just appears. Or equally, it doesn't have to stay a T, we could say it becomes a D, or maybe even just a geminate. It could potentially match the other geminates in this paradigm. So there's lots of options. So looking at these two paradigms, there's a lot of stuff about them that's quite similar, but a couple of little deviations here and there. And as I've said before, that's going to be very important to keep track of over the next few episodes. And there are a few bits and pieces here and there that I might change, but I think I'm going to have to do that off air, and I'm going to call it here for today. So, thank you very much for watching once again. I'll probably have the next episode done, hopefully the first week of January, something like that. we'll see how it goes over the festive period as to how much I can actually get done. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you then. Happy holidays!